Voyage. Called The Last Voyage. It was, I think, 5 or 10 pages of rhymed couplets. My first big long poem. Because I thought I was a poet, and I was hanging around with Jack. We'd met Burroughs. We'd gone up and seen Burroughs together, though we had met him individually briefly before. Lucian Carr had brought me down to Greenwich Village in the Christmas of, I guess it was 44. 43 or 44, I forgot. To Morton Street, where a friend of his, Dave Kammerer, lived, who at the time wasn't home. But Burroughs, who lived on Barrow Street around the corner, was there. And so that was my first meeting with Burroughs. And Lucian had gone out the night before and gotten drunk at some lesbian bar. Some bloody fight had erupted. I think been an argument. He wound up on the floor fighting with some gay guy or girl, I don't know who, and bitten her ear, so there was blood all over the floor. And bitten a piece of the ear off, I think, the earlobe, which I thought was pretty shocking and amazing. I never heard of anything like that, because I was from Eastside High School in Paterson, New Jersey, and I just arrived at Columbia, and even though I'd heard Brahms' first trio, I didn't know people went around getting drunk, biting people's ears off, casually. Maybe it was an exaggeration. So Lucian, it was a small room in a tiny apartment on the first floor of an old brick front Greenwich Village building with a garden rear, French doors into the garden, a fireplace. Burroughs was seated on a low couch near the fireplace, and I was seated on a upturned log end, which served as a coffee table. And Lucian was telling this story, and Burroughs said, quote, "In the words of the immortal bard, 'tis too starved an argument for my sword," unquote. And that was the first time I heard Burroughs talk, and the first thing he said was, quoting the immortal bard, Shakespeare, quote, "'Tis too starved an argument for my sword," unquote, which is the best Shakespeare I've ever heard anyway. Does everybody know that phrase? How many have heard that phrase? "'Tis too starved an argument." Raise your. "'Tis too starved an argument for my sword." Sword, S-W-O-R-D. "'Tis too starved an argument for my sword." Meaning like the argument is foolish and stupid, so why get into a fight about it? But not for my sword. It's out of I think it's out of probably Romeo and Juliet. Some elderly or more experienced japester doesn't want to get into a punk fight. "'Tis too starved an argument for my sword." That was Burroughs' laconic judiciousness instantly displayed. Actually, that one quotation made me appreciate Shakespeare for the first time. The wit of Shakespeare and the sort of funniness of it, the accuracy of the phrasing. Also the archaism, like that "'tis," but "'tis too starved an argument." A starved argument is a very funny idea. The notion of an argument so starved that you wouldn't even want to take your sword to it. Like some mangy cur of a dog, like slinking down the street, who would want to attack it? "'Tis too starved an argument." But that Burroughs is quoting Shakespeare for some kind of funny occasion like that. Lucian had been in this extraordinary little scandalous, ear-biting, romantic bohemian scene, at least from my 17-year-old viewpoint. And Burroughs, from his 33-year-old viewpoint or whatever, was saying, "'Tis too starved an argument for my sword." Enough of that, Lucian. No more. So Burroughs was already born middle-aged, or already born middle-aged, laconic, and cooled out. I remember also the other thing he said Or the other thing I remember that he said on that first occasion, I don't think Kerouac had met Burroughs, and so this is probably the first literary recollection of Burroughs' nature and conversation, was that there was Louise was a lesbian girl who lived upstairs from that apartment, and Bill said he liked her because she was straightforward, manly, and reliable. I'd never met a lesbian before, and much less had to deal with conversation about lesbians right out in the open, much less hear anybody say that he liked her because she was straightforward, manly, and reliable. And that was, I think that was, for me, that was like the determining phrase of all that later became in my brain gay liberation or anything relating to that. It was just the ordinariness of that and the humor. So judging character, really, judging individuals by character, and a funny kind of playfulness, wit in Burroughs there. That's the earliest thing I remember Burroughs saying. So that when we went to see Burroughs later, it was for that laconic, mellowed out, cooled out experience. So we thought he was really experienced because he'd been to Europe. He'd been analyzed by Dr. Federn early, who was one of the people that was directly analyzed by Freud. So actually Burroughs is in the lineage or transmission of the actual Freudian practice. In fact, that time when we all were living in Joan Burroughs' apartment, both Jack and I spent a year, an hour a day, free associating with Burroughs acting as psychiatrist, sitting in a straight back chair while we were on a couch separately. I think Kerouac, whenever he came to town, would do it, so it would be 3 or 4 times a week, and I did it 5 or 6 days a week. A regular formal psychoanalysis with Burroughs as our listener, 1945, 46. I think I've talked about this somewhere or mentioned it, so I won't go into it. It's written up somewhere. But except to conclude that mine sort of came to a conclusion when there was some kind of breakthrough of feeling, and I finally burst out in tears and said, "Nobody loves me," which was, I think, what was bothering me at the time. I just felt that nobody loved me. When I finally came out with it and wept, and Burroughs sat there sort of impersonally, friendly, listening, accommodating, welcoming. So it was kind of a breakthrough for me, a realization of my actual feelings. I mean, feelings certainly I didn't want to admit at that age, 18 or 19, nobody loves me. Shameful, I thought, except I found that's what I was actually saying to him. So I guess that's where I was. So this is about a year later. I had I think a year later, or no, this is a little earlier, 45. Kerouac, as he describes in this book, was going back and forth between his father's deathbed and mother's side, and then coming into town to the apartment on 115th Street, where I was living with Bill and Joan, Hal Chase, and Hunky in and out. Let's see. I guess this is before that then. So Kerouac was coming back and forth to New York from his home. Father not yet fallen ill, I guess. I was living in, I think Hartley Hall or Hartley Hall at Columbia. Had written a long poem called The Last Voyage, derived from reading Rimbaud and Baudelaire. Baudelaire's Invitation au Voyage, or Baudelaire's Invitation to the Voyage and Voyage, Rimbaud's Drunken Boat, Bateau Ivre. The end of the Baudelaire was a favorite quote of all of ours at the time. Plongez au fond du gouffre, l'enfer au ciel, qu'importe, au fond de l'inconnu à trouver de nouveau. Plunge to the bottom of the depths, heaven or hell, what does it matter? At the bottom of the unknown to find the new. It's the end of Au mort, vieux capitaine. The last verse of Le Voyage of Baudelaire. Au mort, vieux capitaine, Levons l'ancre. It is time, let's go. Oh, death, old captain. Raise the anchors, it's time, let's go. Plunge to the bottom of the gulf, heaven or hell, what does it matter? At the bottom of the unknown to find the new. It's relating to new vision, supreme reality. The parallel poem was Rimbaud's last Drunken Boat. So I had written The Last Voyage, as I say, like Jejun rhyme doggerel. Kerouac came uptown from seeing Burroughs to see me about 10 o'clock in the evening, and I read him my long poem, The Last Voyage, which, so we were young poets, and I was reading him my big poem. And so that was like great. And then he'd come from Burroughs, and he had an uncanny conversation with Burroughs, in which Burroughs had said, well, Jack, you know, the trouble with you is, you're just tied to your mother's apron strings, and you're, you know, like you're going in a wide circle around her now, but it's going to get a narrower and narrower circle, and sooner or later you're going to be right in there, like not being able to move away from that, your mother. You're going to wind, that's your fate. That's your destiny. That's your Faustian destiny. And Kerouac was actually chilled and moved a little by it, because it actually was a accurate insight on Burroughs' part, that Kerouac was hung up on his mother. I hadn't realized that. I mean, I thought he was just another guy going in and out of his family. But he really was hung up on his mother and internalizing a great deal of his mother's ideas. So it was sort of prophetic night. And by that time, after we got all this talking done and made up some more poetry, it was maybe 1 o'clock. There was no, Kerouac didn't want to go back to Long Island. I was sort of in love with him, but I hadn't told him. He didn't know I was queer even at that point. So he stayed over with me and slept in my bed. I had a little suite of 2 rooms and a bathroom, like a really large brown-paneled wood rooms, nice big beds, sofas, digs, you know, for like elegant young college aristocrats, Columbia, Ivy League college. My roommate was a guy named William Wart Lancaster, lived in the next room with the door open. His father was the president of the National City Bank. It's like a big deal. And I used to go out to his Manhasset, Long Island house weekends occasionally and have supper with them and Andrei Gromyko, who was then the UN Russian representative. And his father, chairman of the bank, was also the chairman of the Soviet-American Friendship Society. And his mother was the chairman of the Karen Horney League, or some kind of Karen Horney organization. So I got to meet Karen Horney, who was then a big liberal psychoanalytic lady. In fact, I told Lancaster later on that I had sex problems and I'd like to be psychoanalyzed, naively. And so I got an introduction to go visit Karen Horney and get my case evaluated. Anyway, so Bill Lancaster was in the next room in his bed, and Jack and I were sleeping. We had our pajamas on, or our underwear on. And I was a little scared because Jack didn't know I was gay, as they say now, or was interested in him. And I thought he'd probably beat me. Well, he wouldn't beat me up, but I just didn't want to bring it up. Too difficult. Now, at that time, I think Lucian already was in jail. There had been some great scandal at Columbia involving us all as material witnesses to Lucian's problem with the law, his friend David Kammerer being dead at Lucian's hand. So that had been in the New York Times. All of us had been called into the dean's office, Nicholas McKnight. Apparently there was some kind of surveillance system going on. My father had been called to the dean's office several times before and told that Kerouac and I and others had been staying up late till 3 a.m. drinking beer at the West End Bar on 113th Street and Broadway. And been closing the bars, and this was a little scandalous. And I didn't have much money, actually, and didn't have any sense of style, so I was always dressed a little bit Chaplin-esque ragged. And I wasn't shaving too much either. So I probably looked a little bit funky, but not intentionally. I mean, it wasn't an intentional style. It was I didn't know better, actually. I was in an Ivy League school. I didn't have enough money, really, to get the right kind of clothes, and I didn't really actually have the educated taste yet. It took years of hanging around with Burroughs and hanging around with Kerouac to get his idea of what that Tweety Horace Mann prep school look was like, and Burroughs to get what the bankers CIA look was like, the Brooks Brothers. And I didn't really know about that until about probably 2 years until I was in school. I was somehow neurotically negligent of finding out. I'm making up for it now because I'm getting all sorts of Brooks Brothers suits from the Salvation Army everywhere at this point. So you'll see my sartorial splendor the rest of this term, especially at the poetry readings. But at the time, I was kind of slobbish. Partly also, I thought I was ugly anyway. What the hell? I mean, there wasn't much I could do about it. I was an ugly duckling, so probably was with that kind of clothes. But. So the dean had called my father in and complained, and various other parents had been called in. But my father had gone to Columbia, and he was a high school teacher, and, like a middle-class fellow, and to be called into the dean's office to be told that your son, who was in Columbia on a scholarship from the Patterson YMHA, as well as a Columbia scholarship, as well as hard-earned money from my debt-ridden father, it was like awful. Like it didn't happen in good families. It just didn't happen in reality. This was like some tragedy. Maybe I was going to take after my mother, who was already in the bug house. So my father had left the dean's office weeping a number of times. Well, once at least, or twice, thinking that some awful thing would happen, or there was some threat that I'd be kicked out. Kerouac had been banned from the campus as an unwholesome influence on the students. I quote, unwholesome influence on students. This is the language of Dean McKnight. I also got into trouble, and I think my father was called in because after Lucian went to jail, I had started a creative writing class run by Harrison R. Steeves, the head of the Columbia College English department, the very head of the English department, Harrison R. Steeves, an old guy, old geezer, who was teaching creative writing, and I started writing a novel about us, about my gang, or what was going on. But it was really jejune and stupid because I didn't know how to write prose. And it was very stiff, like that little quality of stiffness and self-consciousness as in Kerouac's journal writing. But much worse, in fact. And all mixed up with ideas of André Gide and good prose and fine sentences. But in the closet, so afraid to say anything direct and having no idea of concreteness. So it was also symbolic with invented names and boring and silly, but I was trying to write a novel. And Steeves took that down to the dean and showed it to him, and they decided that they should tell me to stop writing the novel because it was too close to characters around Columbia and might be recognizable and bring scandal to Columbia. So in my creative writing class at college, I was told not to write the novel. And my father was called in to warn me and make sure that was nailed down by the family that I wouldn't write this novel, which I never would have finished anyway. I was too hopelessly entangled with amateurness. So Kerouac, when he was kicked out, as he describes here, had come into conflict with the football coaches, Lou Little and Furman, a guy named Furman who was the assistant coach, who was Kerouac's guy who Kerouac related to on the football team. Kerouac had just dropped the football team and gone off and not showed up for practice one Sunday and quit Columbia. He'd had a lot of trouble with a knee. He'd broken his knee, and Lou Little, the coach, had insisted on him running on the knee and didn't believe it was broken. It was only a week later that Kerouac got it x-rayed and found that there was a broken tibia. So he always was somewhat bitter. Lou Little had also promised to get Kerouac's father a job, according to Vanity of Duluoz, if Kerouac would come and play at Columbia instead of going off to Boston or Notre Dame, where some Catholic coaches had invited him. So there had been some kind of bad feeling between Kerouac and the football jocks, and Kerouac's scholarship had been taken away, and then the celebrity and notoriety and scandal of the situation with Lucian Carr had escalated the dean's notion of Kerouac as an unwholesome influence on the students. Like a bad investment as a football player. Someone who dropped the scene and then gotten into trouble and was in the hands of the police and was written up in the papers and with some overtone of homosexuality somewhere in the New York Times, but not quite certain. And here he was a football jock. And so it was mysterious. Nobody would want to talk about it anyway, openly. Don't write that novel. When the day Kerouac had come to see me, I had noticed that the windows were dirty. We had a blue-clad uniformed scrub lady that would come, an old Irish lady, that I thought was a little anti-Semitic. I was a little sensitive about it. But why I thought so, I don't know. And she hadn't cleaned the windows in my room, so I had decorated them with finger painting, which Butler has no balls. Nicholas Murray Butler was the president of the school at the time. So Butler has no balls, which is, I think there was a song of that kind, or no balls at all, no balls at all. She married a man who had no balls at all. It was a local campus song. It was on various campuses, I'm sure. So there's some kind of jejune college humor. I think I was the editor of the Columbia Jester Review, which is like college humor shot. And I'd also written, fuck the Jews, to get the attention of the washer lady. And then a skull and a crossbones. Just, the outline of a skull with dots and teeth and then a couple crossbones under it. Thinking she'd wipe it off. But she didn't wipe it off, apparently. She had reported it to the dean. Or the assistant, or the dean of student faculty, or the office. And they reported to the student faculty relations guy, whose name was Furman, the same coach that Kerouac had been working with and had a cool scene with. So that morning when Kerouac and I were sleeping off the Poetic Night, like innocent lambs in bed, there was a banging on the door, and then the door opened, and in walked the director of student faculty relations, Dean Furman, who saw us in bed, sleeping. So Kerouac opened one eye, saw the situation instantly, jumped out of bed in his underwear, ran through the door into Bill Lancaster's room, because Lancaster had gone to class, got in Lancaster's bed, and pulled the covers over his head, went back to sleep. And what reminded me of that was this thing about, and besides, dang blasted, I was just sleeping all the time. When he pulled the covers over his head during the bombing, depth charge bombing. So he pulled the covers over his head, and I got out in my skinny legs with my big underwear pants hanging down. And Dean Furman said, "Wipe that off the window." So I grabbed a towel and wiped it off the window. And but I didn't know how to explain it, because I didn't want to say, well, we weren't doing anything in bed. That would have been bringing up the subject. And I didn't know. We hadn't done anything. I was actually, literally speaking, I was a virgin. I hadn't made it with a man or a woman or anything. I was just jacking off since I was 13. Here I was, I don't know, it was 1945 or 6, so I was 20, which is pretty. No wonder I was telling Burroughs a year later, nobody loves me. Nobody had. I suppose that's why I'm so sort of eager now. Trying to make up for lost time. So then Dean Furman said, the dean would like to see you later today. And then, so I got, then he left. And Kerouac just slept on. So I got all dressed, getting ready to face some kind of music. Kerouac got up and went home, went back to his mother. which I thought he wasn't sticking with me in this crisis, sticking around to explain that we hadn't made it or something, in case his testimony was necessary. I didn't figure they'd believe me, but they might have believed both of us, or him, because he was a jock. And then I went downstairs and I found a note in my mailbox in, I guess it was Hartley Hall, Livingston, saying, bill for guest overnight, $2.75. So that was officially registered that somebody had stayed there overnight. And then a note saying the dean would like to see you at 10:45 a.m. So I went into Dean McKnight's office. Now I had already read Céline that Burroughs had given me. The beginning of the Céline Journey to the End of the Night is he and his friend Robinson are at a cafe drinking, getting a little bit drunk. It's the time of the beginning of World War I. All of a sudden they see a big happy parade of drunkards coming down the street with bands and fifes and tootling and flags and ladies, and everybody's happy, and they get arm in arm. They get up and join the parade, and they wander off to the edge of town, still drunk and still drinking, and finally a gate shuts behind them, and they find that they're in the army. It's like a recruiting parade for French recruiting parade, World War I. Chapter 2, they're in the field of battle, and Céline looks around, and there's all these people crying for their mommies, and shells whistling over, and insane captains demanding that the horses be brought forward, and issuing contradictory orders to Céline to march forward into the face of battle and the teeth of the bullets. And he has a sentence about, I suddenly realized that everybody around me was completely insane, and I had better take steps if I wanted to survive this situation, I'd better take steps to dissociate myself completely with their mad schemes, or to evade completely, to make myself invisible. It's a very funny sentence. I mean, it's a great, I think it's one of the great moments of Western literature when the hero of Céline wakes up in the middle of the battle and realizes that everybody around him is crazy and figures he'd better figure out what's going on and get out of there. I would say that would be the essence of hipness, whatever was hip. Whatever hip was supposed to be, the word hip was supposed to be in 1945. Whatever we thought of it, it was that attitude of waking up in the midst of the rest of society and finding that everybody was crazy and that it was a mad scheme that was going to destroy everybody and nobody was going to get out alive. In fact, prematurely. It was going to be premature pain and death. So with that attitude in mind, I walked into the dean's office. And Dean McKnight faced me across the desk and said, "Mr. Ginsberg, I hope you realize the enormity of what you've done." Unquote. And I said, "Oh, I do, sir, I do. If you can only tell me what I can do to make this up." Cringing and sniveling and terrified and trying just agreeing with him. I want to get out of this situation, which is completely embarrassing. And what if he calls up my father again? It makes my father come to the office and weep more and have another heart attack. Besides, saying that I slept with Kerouac, and I didn't sleep with Kerouac, so it was a very confusing situation. But I still was. Then Dean said he'd think it over. Then William Lancaster, my roommate, decided for the good of things, because he was pretty smart from another point of view. He'd been psychoanalyzed to the marrow since he was a kid, since he was 12, because his mother was the president of the Karen Horney Society. So he went into the dean and said, "Dean McKnight, I understand that there's some difficulty, and I would like to clear up the situation. I understand there are allegations of homosexuality. Is that what's at issue? When Kerouac and Ginsberg slept together?" Well, and the dean said, No, nobody said anything about it. Nobody has mentioned it. Nobody has brought up the subject. I am not accusing anybody of anything at all. So Lancaster said, straightforward, manly, and reliable, he said, "Well, I can assure you that nothing of the sort went on because the door was open and I was there all night, and they were old friends, and they just slept like college boys sleep." Just very cool, sensible, straightforward. I was astounded because I was so terrified of the situation, being queer actually and not having told anybody. See, I guess my terror was that I was still in the closet and I hadn't told anybody, and so this was sort of trapping me and the consequences of something I didn't even do, although I wished it. See. But Lancaster came to my aid. And, Kerouac just stayed away. So I couldn't get any testimony out of him, though obviously he was right. What was he supposed to do? Go into the dean's office and say, he didn't suck my cock or something? We didn't do nothing. He was banned from the campus. And Dean McKnight said, you realize that Mr. Kerouac is banned from Jack Kerouac is banned from the campus, or is not supposed to set foot on the campus. He's an unwholesome influence on the students, as you can see here in the situation. Get you into trouble. Then I brought my father in, and he wept again. So finally, then I went to see Trilling, and Trilling, I remember Trilling was very funny. He didn't know what the whole thing was about, really, and at the same time, he knew me and he knew Kerouac, and he realized there was something stupid about it. But he didn't know how to analyze it, and what was disturbing him and his wife most of all probably was what was reported to them was that I had made anti-Semitic remarks. As if that were the point of the story. That was like just sort of some little tiny footnote, but that's what they were hung up on. So I remember it was in his office, and he said, well, I talked to the dean, but there doesn't seem to be any, he seems to have made up his mind. And he irritatedly, or sympathetically with me, and irritatedly slapped his bookcase with his hand. He was a distinguished professor, and I never saw a distinguished professor slap a bookcase in irritation before, or some sort of sympathetic gesture of wildness. I went to Mark Van Doren, who was trying to be helpful also, both. But it was finally decided that I got a letter from the dean that I had to withdraw from Columbia and go out into the world and work and not return until I had become more matured and had seen a psychiatrist and got a letter from a psychiatrist saying that I had worked for about a year out in the world and I was now matured enough so that I was capable of assuming proper responsibilities for being a member of the academic community. That was a terminology, proper participation in the academic community. And so I got kicked out of Columbia that way for a while. Very easy, soft kick out, actually. But the thing that rung in my ears was, Mr. Ginsberg, I hope you realize the enormity of what you've done. Because actually I hadn't done anything, I thought. I was afraid to do anything. I wanted to do something. I lay there longing all night, thinking and dreaming, but I didn't do nothing. That was about Kerouac's sleepiness. Yeah?
Jack get much out of his courses at Columbia University? Did you learn much about literature and writing there?
Yes, he did. But the humanities course is for a first-year course. You got to read Homer. You got to read the Iliad, the Odyssey, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Plato, Aristotle, Euripides, Dante. Lucretius. The only problem is he was playing football. He was, as he says in this book, he was playing football. He was working on doing practice scrimmage every afternoon. He was also working in the food service, dishing out food for his meals, and then trying to read and trying to write, so that he didn't get a chance to read all this stuff that was whizzing by him, except that he wanted to read, so that he'd goof off and take time off and start reading and not go to football practice or get all involved with Mark Van Doren's Shakespeare course and not do the football thing. So that was setting up a split, because he got less and less interested in the sort of mad anger of football and bone break and emptiness of run 100-yard dash in old Ensenada. And also he was disaffected with Lou Little and the team, because he vainly thought, and his father thought, that they weren't using him properly and letting him play as well as he could, sending him out to play. And his father was pissed off because Lou Little didn't get his father the job that Lou Little was supposed to do as a payoff for bringing Kerouac to Columbia. So there was all this father-family, some kind of, I was just noticing it. I didn't know that about his father till I reread Vanity of Duluoz. So there was all this hang-up about the team, and he was getting more literary, but didn't have enough time to read. read on his own a lot, naturally. But he didn't get much out of the courses. The only one he ever mentioned was Mark Van Doren's Shakespeare. Though at that time, in fact, almost immediately after Lucian Carr went to jail, and maybe before I was kicked out, there was one professor we liked whom I mentioned, Raymond Weaver. So he took his novel, The Sea Is My Brother, to Raymond Weaver. And Weaver read it very sympathetically. I think I may have mentioned that Weaver had been in Japan and had used some sort of Zen-style questioning in his class as part of his teaching technique. So he came away from Weaver with a list of books to read, including the Egyptian Gnostics, I think Melville's Pierre, Plotinus. So that was the first introduction of mystical Gnostic zap minds, Zen-style, gap, emptiness literature that we encountered, or the first suggestion. That was actually the first time I ever heard of the word Gnostic, and that sounded really interesting, whatever it meant. I had no idea what it meant. That's like as you may know, that's the Western tradition, or the unofficial tradition of, I suppose, the equivalent of, out of which matters like tarot or some astrology come from. I would say Western Gnostic is similar to Eastern Buddhist. There are Gnostic systems with many worlds, as many worlds as there are brains. So that was the first, from Weaver. So that's something he got out of Columbia. But that was after he quit, and he just went as a private goof citizen, as a young poet, really, private young goofy poet, to see Weaver. And Weaver was very open. Weaver and Van Doren shared offices, as I said. But now that I'm 45 years old and in a continual rage myself, I can understand and sympathize with that chief mate at last, and I know what way the salmon jump up that river of bitter time and pain, wifey. So he's 45 when he's writing this, and actually pissed off, still. There was a pretty phrase that I always liked here. On 189, and I'm wondering, he's on the ship, Joseph Conrad wasn't wrong. There are old sea dogs who've been to everywhere from Bombay to British Columbia smoking their pipes on poops of old sea vessels. Practically born at sea they are, and die at sea and don't even look up. Even have cats down below for the rats, and sometimes a dog. What tobacco they smoke, what they do, where they go when they put on their glad rags in Macau. To do what? I thought that glad rags in Macau was pretty sound. When they put on their glad rags in Macau. I think that's sort of the essence of Kerouac. Playful, stylishness, actually. Sometimes it's playing with the stylishness of a slang phrase, like put on your glad rags, dearie, we're going off to the show. But combining it with put on their glad rags in Macau. It's an odd ear. Perfect. The music is great there. To do what? What a vast crock it all is, for me to even dare to think of anything when all is said and done. Mighty, I sigh. Get those lines wound right. Talking to myself. I laughed all night. Not even a drink since Brooklyn. Who needs it? This is the key, was that glad rags in Macau for that line.
What's Macau?
Oh, Macau, the town outside of Hong Kong, is it? Portuguese Macau, it's right outside of Hong Kong. Well, it's a big dock port, Freeport, so lots of ships go in there. A little Portuguese piece of mainland, and even now, isn't it? Piece of mainland China that's a free port belonging to the Portuguese. So that's a big opium center and a big place for contraband and counterfeiting and mysteries and shadows and evil Chinamen and sinister spies and places where sailors hear sirens in the night. while they're on an opium reverie. Go out and they go off a ship and put on their glad rags and go offshore and go into Macau. So they put on their glad rags in Macau. And they take off their dirty old oil-soaked engineers or wipers uniforms and get all dressed up spiffy and go out and put on their glad rags in Macau. It's just a normal common sense thing. It's just such a pretty way of saying that. What do they do when they put on, what do they do? What tobacco they smoke? What they do? Where they go when they put on their glad rags in Macau? To do what? Go out and get laid, do what? I just assumed, everybody knew what Macau was. There's a funny, anecdote on page 194 that Kerouac was a sort of key reference point for Kerouac for the British character and for British sound in his prose. Well, morning and a few cold beers with American Air Force men in Piccadilly beer bars, where they chill the beer for American tastes, a walk around, even a nap in the park during an air raid, and then I have to find my way to Threadneedle Street, because Lillian or somebody took most of my money away. I think it fell out of my pocket in Piccadilly Dark to borrow money for the train looking back to my ship in Liverpool from an American shipping office. An old man carrying an umbrella and wearing a Homburg hat comes up to me and says imperiously, tapping me on the shoulder, "I say, which way to Threadneedle Street?" unquote. He kept for years repeating, "I say, which way is Threadneedle Street?" as his idea of what English sounded like. "I say, which way to Threadneedle Street?" I don't think he wrote it up until 1967, but that was like a little anecdote that was sort of like a touchstone for him. 6:20. So I'll finish with, I want to continue on this book for one more shot next, but I want to finish with one paragraph. And it was that last morning before we got ready to sail to Brooklyn that I devised the idea of the Duluoz legend. It was a gray, rainy morning, and I sat in the purser's office over his typewriter. He was having his last drunk, I guess. And I saw it. A lifetime of writing about what I'd seen with my own eyes, told in my own words, according to the style I decided on at whether 21 years old or 30 or 40 or whatever later age, and put it all together as a contemporary history record for future times to see what really happened and what people really thought. To see what really happened and what people really thought. That's page 195. It's exactly what he did. To see what really happened and what people really thought. A real simple idea. What people really thought. And that is the conception of a literary career. What people really thought was a big surprise to me that you could do that. Was that?
Wasn't that kind of connected with that Burroughs thing about the English nobleman in the middle of something coming out and saying something already?
Just too starved an argument for my thought.
No, before that you mentioned in an earlier class about the prototype of the Burroughs character who was the big affluent societal type person and yet would come out with some grave
Yeah. I guess we'll get, I forgot what I said about it.
the real meaning of the story.
Antler was going to see a few people. The people who want credit, can you stay behind and stay with Antler? I'm going to be getting together working with some musicians Friday at my house. So if anybody plays brass, not piano, but brass or strings, if you feel like playing for a little 7-minute number while me and Peter do our poetry reading, and maybe accompanying Peter on a country western, show up for rehearsal if you are actually a good musician.